Twin Tales Publishing presents Prison Days, Meeting Monsters by Simon King, narrated by Todd Waites. Forward. Welcome back for another walk around these corridors, which by now must feel more than a little familiar to you. To think that this will be the 14th trip behind the walls is not something I would have fathomed when I first began this author journey way back in 2018. If there's one thing that I've learned about prison life which makes it such a unique place, it's that the people are the ones who truly give the prison its character. Not just the officers or the prisoners, but everybody combined. There's good and bad on both sides of the fence, which is why it's just a unique environment to work in. When I first thought about writing a series such as this, I spent weeks and months looking for other works which might have been released before, and what I found wasn't what I wanted to write. From the very first book, I knew that if I added too much of myself into the mix, then you, the reader, would find your experience swayed in whatever direction I chose to take you. This is, after all, a medium directly linked to your subconscious. What I ended up doing was nothing short of difficult. I practiced. Over several months, I spent countless hours writing about my experiences inside, and each time I finished, I would put the words away for at least a couple of weeks. This might sound strange, but to regular authors, it's not that unusual. It allows us a bit of distance from the idea, to recenter ourselves and let the work slip a bit, so that when we eventually return to it, we have a refreshed eye to analyze it with. What I found in those original manuscripts wasn't what I was trying to achieve. There was far too much of me venting, of me unloading the stresses after long days, and not the kind of storytelling I was hoping for. What I needed was to learn to pull back, so that when a reader, like yourself, finally had the chance to undertake your own journey behind the walls, the opinions you formed were your own. Instead, I began to write in a way which I had never tried before. During those early years of my career, I often found myself surrounded at parties and barbecues by people keen for a story. They listened with such invested interest that at times I felt as if I was sitting on some random stage and working my way through a presentation. It was the exact thing I had been searching for all along, a kind of voice with which I could share the details of the long shifts, the intricate relationships I formed, as well as the gut-wrenching incidents I witnessed. It is with that very same voice I now sit here and write these words, as if you, the reader, are sitting in front of me and listening in as I begin yet another trip behind the razor wire. Opinion is something I've always tried my best to keep out of this series, so that you might have the opportunity to form your own. What I have found, especially through the hundreds of reviews this series has amassed over the course of its life, is that everybody judges books through opinion. I guess, in a way, it's how we approach most things in life. If I told you I hated a certain movie for a specific reason and you hadn't seen it, how would my opinion affect yours? Whenever I watch TikTok and see an influencer diss a book because they didn't approve of the cursing or the level of violence or sex scenes, I always shudder and feel sorry for the author, because so many reviews are based on nothing more than personal opinion. Just because I love something doesn't mean you will. Does that make it bad? Which is why I try so hard to keep my opinion out of my Prison Days books. Just because I see an inmate in the wrong doesn't mean you might. I'm biased, especially when witnessing certain events while in uniform. Does that make a situation right or wrong because of my point of view? This is where I love hearing from readers who understand the reasons for my lack of personality in the writing. The emails and messages, even the reviews which mention how much they enjoyed the books because they could make their own mind up on how things went. And that's where I need to turn to this book, one which I contemplated since the very beginning. While I've already released the Inmates series and taken you through some of the specific prisoners I had the pleasure of looking after during my time, I've never spoken about some of the darker people inside. The murderers, the rapists, those who turn units on their heads whenever they arrive. The difficult part for me is that it's impossible to name people specifically. In Australia, we have rules and regulations surrounding the release of information, especially when it comes to people's privacy. And, as strange as it seems, that includes prisoners. The last thing I want is to face a bunch of lawyers looking for blood. And then, there's also the other side of the crimes, the many victims and families involved. If you've already read my book, After the Lies, then you'll know how my own family has been affected by a cruel predator who targeted my stepson when he was just 11. While I worked inside maximum security at the time, my own family was going through the horror of court cases, counseling, and informational overload. I began to see things in a whole new light. For every criminal, there are sometimes a dozen or more victims, including families on both sides. The pain and emotional trauma extends far beyond what people might consider, and it is those people and their privacy I also have to respect. So, if you thought this was going to be some book sharing the horrific crimes of some of the country's worst criminals in graphic details, the way I've seen a lot of books from other countries do, then I apologize in advance and ask that maybe you return the book now. It would save both of us the hassle of wasting time with a read you may not find interesting and me suffering a 1-star review for not meeting your expectations. What I will share throughout the following pages, though, is the way I met each of these monsters and tried to understand their new lives, how it felt to stare evil in the face, and the surprising truth which downright shocked me when I finally found who the real monsters were. If curiosity does get the better of you, and you do want to put faces to some of them, simply Google Victorian serial killers, Victorian murderers, or countless other searches to find those who are right now serving time in the prisons down here. That sort of information is out there right now for the world to find. All one needs to do is look. For me, this series has always been about more than just the crimes these criminals committed, because that information is already out there. What this series is meant to give is a deeper insight into the lives they lead after they have been sentenced and fallen out of the public eye, the kind of information people rarely hear about. If you're still reading, then I hope you've decided to stick with me for a bit longer and follow me around the units for another look. I promise to share it all, every emotion triggered when I came face to face with monsters. Thank you for giving me a bit of time out of your day, and I hope you managed to make it through to the very end. And when it's all said and done, I hope you have gained a little further insight into the crazy world behind the walls. It's time to take another ride, so hang on tight and let's get started as I unclip the keys and find the one to take us through to the other side of the walls. It's time to go and find some monsters. Simon King. Chapter 1. Complacency. No other word has ever frightened me more during my days inside maximum security. The thought that I could be the one to cause not only my own death, but also those officers working beside me, was one at the very forefront of my mind whenever I signed on for a new shift. The funny thing is, complacency was also the very first word which came to mind whenever I watched certain officers going about their day, namely those who craved attention. Don't get me wrong, I worked with a hell of a lot of good people during my time inside, the kinds of officers I'd back up in a heartbeat. But then, there were those who performed their duties quite differently from the rest, almost needing a pat on the back every step of the way. You know the type. The ones who don't do anything they don't have to unless someone significant is watching. The kind who need validation for any minor role they play. They were the kind of people a person would cross to the other side of the road for, just to avoid having to say good morning to them. So, why am I bringing them up? Because when you begin to see the types of weapons crooks have been known to carry, when you see the injuries they leave on victims, when you hear about the crimes they committed, you quickly realize there's another word which an officer needs to learn in an instant, and that word is consequences. Consequences can come from one of two places. They can come from someone working on our side of the fence, such as a supervisor, manager, or even another officer working beside you. Or they can come from the prisoners themselves via an assault, or perhaps even worse. When a person begins to see the types of consequences which can happen inside, it doesn't take long to understand the repercussions of turning a blind eye. The one thing I cannot ignore during these past Prison Days books is the amount of messages I have received from prospective officers, those considering a career behind bars. When I think back to the amount of training I received before being handed the keys to the facility, I shudder. I truly do. Not because of what I knew I would see, but because of everything I didn't know I would witness, which somebody should have told me. A book should exist, something of a handbook, if you will, which is handed to each and every prospective correctional officer on the first day of their training, which tells you everything not covered in the course. I'm talking about things like how to handle a crook screaming directly into your face, the constant insults thrown at you, or even just how to carry yourself through the course of your day without looking as if you want to take on the world. Those first few days into my time behind bars were perhaps the most eye-opening of all, and not because of anything the prisoners did. It was what I saw happening on the other side of the tracks, the actions from those I was supposed to look up to. Complacency and consequences. The two words I wish I could share with every single new recruit on their very first day. Complacency has seen prisoners let through into the wrong yard so they can conduct a hit on a target. Complacency has helped 3 crooks isolate one of their own from the rest and lead to a horrific assault involving nightmarish weapons. Complacency has led to a prisoner's cell door not being properly locked, leaving a female officer alone in a unit with a potential rapist. And if you want to know the kinds of people who won't hesitate to take advantage of an officer's complacency, then just watch the nightly news or read online news articles. Each time a violent criminal is apprehended and taken before the courts, they don't magically vanish into thin air. It's crazy to think how quickly society forgets that these individuals still exist, spending their time behind bars. Meeting monsters is about the dark side of the job, the reality of those an officer is put in charge of monitoring. Depending on where one works, an officer may be all alone and responsible for an entire unit filled with monsters. I know, because that was my reality on more than a few occasions. Something else I wanted to point out, which came as a bit of a surprise to me during those first few months, was how quickly the novelty wore off. When I say novelty, I mean exactly that. One of the ways new recruits are so easily identified from others, aside from their sparkly new uniforms, is by how wide their eyes are on those first few times out on the floor. The first time they see an infamous prisoner walk past, their eyes are so wide they could pop out if someone smacked them in the back of the head. The novelty isn't something anybody can really avoid those first few weeks. The place tends to have that kind of effect on a person. But it didn't take long for those wide eyes to leave me, not when I began to hear stories about who it was I'd be watching during my shift. See that guy over there with his sleeves pushed up? It was something said to me during one of my first experiences on the floor. We'd been shadowing officers during our training course and split up amongst various units. One of the officers sat in the station beside me, showing me how to fill out a logbook when he looked up and saw this particular crook. "Yeah, go on," I said, not sure what to expect. "Cut his girlfriend up into pieces and then dumped her into the ocean. Bits of her washed up on a beach, which is how he was caught." Imagine the moment, with us just sitting innocently in the station, and this guy pointing to a man standing less than 20 meters from us, capable of that type of butchery. And there I was, having had nothing to do with any type of criminal in my life, watching this monster go about his day as if it was nothing. It was one of the other officers sitting behind us who put forth a different point of view, and I'll be honest, it did give me something to think about. "I'd rather not know what they did," she said without looking up. And that right there was where opinions differ. Remember that word complacency? Could not wanting to know a crook's past be considered a form of complacency? Maybe it is, although she certainly didn't think so. And as if to make her point, she gave quite a good argument on the matter. Remember, we were shadowing these officers, which meant it was up to them to share insights into the role which might help us in the job. "It's your job to look after these crooks," she said. "No bias, no judgment, no favoritism. If I knew a guy was in here for murdering a child, I don't know whether I could willingly help him fill out a request form or hand him some dishwashing liquid. If I don't know, then I can treat them all the same." Treating them all the same was another part of the job officers were expected to carry out. Regardless of their crime, we had a duty of care to each and every one of them, to give them everything they were entitled to. This included child killers, rapists, murderers, and any other number of depraved crimes. The thing is, every new officer needs to make their own mind up as to how they choose to conduct themselves. The bottom line is, there's a job which needs to be done, regardless of personal feelings towards certain types of crime. Complacency is a word which can be seen in any number of ways. Better not to know their history and cruise through work without the added stress of having an opinion. Or is it? The truth is, not knowing a prisoner's history is a little like going into a job interview without knowing the role you're applying for, or baking a cake without first reading the recipe. Crooks have histories. They have a file for a reason, so an officer has the ability and opportunity to prepare themselves for future interactions. If a prisoner has a short temper and has assaulted family and friends, then I want to know about it. If he's killed people for certain reasons, then that is something I would probably need to know. In this prison, I do not have the luxury of hiding behind bulletproof glass or thick steel bars. I'm right out there on the floor, walking amongst them and by them. I'm talking dozens at a time. In the majority of units, prisoners have free rein, to a certain extent, meaning up to 60 or 70 of them have an open unit to roam around in. Us officers get to sit in a station set up in the middle of the floor with no protection whatsoever. There are times when I take what's known as a tier walk, with every unit required to conduct several throughout the day. In essence, these exist to give staff a greater insight into the unit's running, while also giving inmates the chance to interact with officers if they need to. The politics in here work in a very different way to the way they do on the outside, and it pays to learn them as quick as you can. One such example is how a prisoner speaks to an officer when they need something. Because our station is located in the very center of the unit's common area, mainly to give us the ability to see every part of the unit from our seats, it also gives the prisoners a perfect view of us. This means that anybody approaching the station will be seen. If an inmate is in fear of their life due to threats or intimidation by other inmates and he approaches the station, they'll know about it, and the repercussions can be severe. For an inmate to share such information with us requires taking one hell of a risk, because the second he shares with us, he's labeled a snitch, a rat, or a dog. Snitching on others is an absolute no-no, leading to some severe repercussions. Unfortunately for those getting hassled, them approaching us doesn't even need to be for them to tell us anything. It might just be to ask an innocent question, like when the next shopping day is, or when the med trolley is due. If they speak too quietly and nobody can hear what they say, the consequences will normally be the same. I've seen guys get labeled a rat for asking the most mundane questions. By doing tier walks, it takes officers out of the station and amongst the population. We generally pass by each and every cell during these walks, taking care to get a glimpse into each door. I've seen plenty of inmates notice us begin our tier walk, hurry back to their cell, and then motion for us to pause when we reach their door. Most officers recognize when we get signaled and will normally ask some innocent question about something totally unrelated to bring us closer, such as why they have a certain poster on their wall. Once closer to the door, they will normally give us a quick one-liner, enough for us to get an understanding. It doesn't always work, of course. Sometimes an officer mightn't have the experience to recognize an inmate's need for protection or their cry for help. And on rare occasions, an officer might be carrying an extra chip on their shoulder and just blatantly refuse to listen because they don't want the extra work to deal with. Tier walks on the whole are a great way to bring us closer to the unit's population. I've taken them plenty of times, sometimes pausing to lean on a top-tier handrail to watch a game of pool or a couple of hands of poker. Table tennis is also quite popular and gives the inmates something else to focus on while the rest get to cheer them on. The tier walks also serve another purpose, and that is to remind the crooks who the unit belongs to. Some grow very protective of their surroundings and will often walk past during a tier walk with a smart comment about us invading their home. I've had crooks come up to me while I've been pausing to watch a match of some sort, asking whether I needed anything. Having us so close to their cells will often make them uncomfortable. Life in a prison unit can feel like another planet, with weird rules the outside world would never understand. But the one thing that I always remind myself of is the fact that, regardless of the rules, the prisoners are very real, and not all of them play by those rules. The monsters in this place are also real. The complacency in this place is real. And as frightening as the words sound to me, even the consequences are real. Very real. When mistakes happen, the consequences from them normally come fast, and the person normally left to deal with the mistakes are usually the ones who've had no prior involvement in the matter. Before I go on, I need to point out that not every prison is the same as the one I worked in. Australia's correctional facilities operate as uniquely as those in other countries, with each following their own sets of rules, guidelines, operating procedures, and everything else needed to run them efficiently. But what they all have in common is the people they're sent to lock up. From what I have seen, prisons, and prisoners for that matter, seem to display the same characteristics no matter where you go. I've watched enough documentaries on National Geographic to compare other prisons to my own. The sounds, the demands, the endless neediness, the assaults, the tension, the abuse, it all comes across as one and the same. As I sit here writing this chapter, I'm thinking back to those first few days, listening to the echoes of prisoners shouting to each other across the unit while locked into their cells. Hearing them burn one of their own for something as insignificant as keeping a mop in their cell for too long. If you didn't know, Burning is mostly abuse, and it's best listened to after lockdown, when crooks first find themselves locked in after a long day of activities. It can be quite funny to listen to, at times, especially when the crook doing the burning has a certain sense of wit about him. Some of the insults shouted under the door can have officers in stitches, while at other times, it can be a real headache. As with everything, though, even the burning has consequences, which is why officers tend to pay attention when it's happening. We have a duty of care, not just to the one getting burned, but also to the burner, or burners. Remember, a chihuahua might have a huge bark when safely behind a gate, but open it, and what happens? It's the same with burning. Some crooks forgetting that within a few short hours, their own walls open back up, and their temporary protection falls by the wayside. If we can see a potential for injury, it falls on us to make the call about who we let out. Consequences, remember? But this book isn't so much about us, but more about those we've been entrusted to watch, the ones taking up space in the cells, their crimes often too shocking to comprehend. Watching them is one thing, but actually knowing them, that's the stuff of nightmares. Chapter 2. When it came to starting my career in corrections, I was about as green as a person can get. The closest I'd ever been to standing face to face with a criminal was if I stood in front of my television watching the nightly news. As I've mentioned before, I came from the other side of the tracks, so to speak. So when I found myself standing in the middle of a unit filled with those classified into maximum security, I considered myself a true amateur, a child thrown into the deep end of a shark-infested swimming pool. The feeling is something akin to attending the first day of a new high school, with dozens of eyes watching you, trying to get a sense of who you really are. Only in this case, those eyes weren't trying to see whether they would want you as a friend to hang out with during breaks. No, in this place, they were sizing you up to see how you would benefit their needs. Were you a pushover, weak-minded, lacked confidence? Did you exhibit the signs they needed in order to convince you to smuggle gear in for them? Screws didn't matter to inmates. What mattered was how they could use us. But smuggling shit in, or trying to get close to us for other advantages, such as cell allocations and stuff, isn't our only benefit to them. We also took up spots on their entertainment schedule. Prison time is slow time, which leaves a hell of a lot of free time to fill. Rather than sit in their cells and twiddle their thumbs, a lot of inmates prefer to come up with all the ways they can make an officer's day hell, from sending them on random errands to giving them reasons for confrontations. I remember one of my first units, the place filled with all manner of societal refuse. We're talking rapists, child abusers, outright pedophiles, killers, terrorists, and so many more crimes to raise a person's pulse a bit. This was the kind of place where it paid to keep one eye in the back of your head, and I mean that literally. Assaults on staff weren't uncommon. There I was, standing in the officer's station and watching a serial killer go about his day. He'd done his killings back in the 70s and 80s, so the day I was watching him, he resembled more of what you might class as a senior citizen. He moved with the speed of a man with back pain, slightly hunched over as he shuffled his way between jobs. The unit had been his home for a decade, so he'd made himself pretty comfy, not only claiming the kitchen for himself, but also the job of greeting each new arrival. That meant every new prisoner arriving into the unit would need to go through an induction, led by a man who'd been on the cover of almost every newspaper in the country during his heyday. I remember the first time I looked into his eyes, a moment I hadn't had a chance to prepare for. I'd been busy listening to one of the other officers explain how to look up inmates' bank balances on the computer, and so had my attention fixed elsewhere. "Grab a pen, boss?" They were the first words he spoke to me, and as I looked at him, met the gaze of a man who'd taken the lives of an unknown number of people. I say unknown because the true number has never been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. What the world did know was that he'd murdered children and raped several women over the course of 20 years. It's weird when I think back to that day, remembering the moment I first looked into the eyes of evil. As I sit here, running the moment through my mind, I find myself somewhat taken aback because of what I saw in those eyes. I know what you're expecting me to say. It's probably the same thing I expected to find when I first saw his name on the muster sheet, an infamous name listed amongst dozens of others. I expected the darkest, blackest pits in his eyes, the soul behind them having long gone into the depths of hell itself. When I met his gaze, I felt vulnerable, the evil ready to jump from his body into mine, the way a spirit might possess another's body. This was, after all, the face of a man some saw as the last of their lives. There was no evil. There wasn't even a hint of aggression behind those eyes. The only thing I saw was an old man asking for a pen. To be honest, it took me back a bit. The bald head, the gold-rimmed glasses, the slight hunched-over back from an old-timer carrying the heavy years on his shoulders. It was exactly how you might find a senior citizen in any part of the world asking to borrow a pen. The fact we stood in the middle of a unit in maximum security didn't seem to make a difference. If he'd been on the outside and people knew who he was, the reaction might have been different. Their preconceived idea of who he had once been would be enough to instill fear into their very heart. Back in the day, sure, I could see how that would have been more than possible. But now, well into his twilight years, the evil which people might have recognized is long gone. I didn't doubt he still had it in him to take someone's life, but from where I stood, the visible threat had well and truly faded away. I still think back to the day I first met him and wonder whether I might have felt a hint of disappointment. When one considers the monsters who cause such horrific pain to their victims, it's strange to find nothing more than a bare shell of everything we assume them to be. It was as if the weight of the man who stood before me didn't come anywhere near the weight of the monster everybody remembers. During that first shift with someone whom I considered one of the biggest names in the prison, I watched the remnants of a nightmare go about his day like an ordinary man. He'd shuffle from one job to another, running the kitchen as if employed in an ordinary cafe. The other prisoners respected him, helping out with their own designated duties to keep the unit running as efficiently as possible. The thing about Yara North, which always amazed me no matter how many times I walked into the unit, was just how clean it was when compared to other units. This could have been a boarding house for down-on-their-luck men, or some charity-run home. Even the smell of the unit felt out of place. During those early days, I felt myself bombarded with emotions each time entering a new unit. My senses would explode with a million different stimulants, with everything from the eyes watching me to the energy of the room. It was the basic sensations which tended to grow on me, those insignificant reminders such as the sounds and the smells which became all too familiar. But Yara North was different. Different in almost every way. For one thing, it always looked spotless, with not a hair out of place. I don't think I ever saw a filled bin or a dirty dish left out. Everything had its place, and as for the smell, it was a world away from other units. I said it felt different in almost every way for one reason. While the overall cleanliness of the unit was miles away from the other units, the clientele of the place stretched miles away in the opposite direction. The smells, the cleanliness, it had a way of elevating the notion that this place was different. You could feel it in your bones. But this was a place which felt different for a reason. If I think back to the first few months of working in the prison and the inmates I either supervised directly or escorted to and from the unit, goosebumps break out across my skin. These prisoners weren't in the unit for unpaid parking tickets or robbing the local 7-Eleven. These were the criminals who wouldn't last 5 minutes in general population. Yara North is also known as the Boneyard, and the inmates themselves known as boners. There are other names for them as well, of course, such as rock spider, pedos, or even tamps, as in someone who tampers with children. This was the place where pedophiles lived, kept away from the rest of the prison population through isolation. In this unit, no prisoner would ever leave the confines of the yard without an escort. Sure, mainstream prisoners would see them as they walked through the corridors to wherever they needed to go, but with 10-foot-high fences holding them back, they had no chance of getting their hands on them. They have another name, a more professional categorization of who they are: protection prisoners, protected in almost every way. The prison keeps them isolated in their own units, away from the rest of the population due to the extreme threat. Crimes against children, as well as women, is seen as the lowest of the low, and the rest of the prison has zero tolerance for such acts. Retribution is rare, but when it happens, it's quick and brutal. The first serial killer I saw wasn't the only one in that league, of course. There were others, two specifically who I also remember interacting with on a number of occasions. But, just like the first, I think the true horror for me was the distinct lack of evil I saw within them, as if the fire inside had burnt itself out. I said that to one of my offsiders once, and his own interpretation made sense. The evil inside those fuckers is just sleeping. Give it a reason to wake and watch how fast they go back to their old ways. In all the years I watched them from the officer's station, I never witnessed any of those serial killers say a harsh word to anyone. No arguments, no raised voices, nothing which I would have seen as aggression. It was as if they had trained their calmer side, or just managed to control themselves better than anyone else. But Yara North had other inmates as well, those who also made headlines across the country. The most memorable, which left a lasting impression on me, had been sent to prison for terrorism offenses. They spent months going back and forth to court, with each needing daily escorts to and from admissions to process them for their appearances. I saw them during many night shifts, either escorting them back to the unit after their day or taking them to admissions during those early mornings. Again, they were so different from the usual crooks I needed to escort. It's weird. I was about to write about the routine with a normal prisoner and then compare it to these terrorists, but as I wrote the word normal, I found myself pausing. Normal? What the hell makes a prisoner normal? Normal is not a word I would use for anybody behind the walls, not even staff. And that's exactly the reason why this job is so unique in nature. Nothing is normal, with no two incidents ever being the same. The unpredictability in this place can be fatal when not realized. I've seen the assaults on staff, the murders on inmates. If you try to compare one person to another and assume they come from the same material, then you're in for some pain. Those terrorists were some of the most polite prisoners I ever dealt with. It sounds weird, but it's the way things went. Nothing but pleases and thank yous, respect all the way. Like the previously mentioned serial killers, I didn't see a single hint of disdain whenever I opened their cell door. The only words they had for me were either good morning or thanks, boss. Whenever they asked questions, they were worded in a way which held the same politeness. Did I think the authorities got it wrong? Was I under the impression they could have been innocent, given their politeness and respect? No, not even a little bit. The thing is, guilt or innocence is completely irrelevant. For us, as officers, we don't spend a second thinking about a prisoner's guilt or innocence. That's between them and the system. Our job is to keep them safe and make sure they don't walk out the front door. The courts found them guilty and sentenced each to a very long sentence behind bars, and that's where it ends for us. We have a duty to carry out, and if someone is sent to the prison to be remanded into custody, then so be it. Trying to find out whether a person is actually guilty isn't something which should be crossing any guard's mind. All I know from personal experience is that the horror I expected to see in the eyes of someone who had taken so many lives simply wasn't there. Whether shielded or faded out over time, to me, it simply didn't show. I'm sure they remain ever capable of the acts which brought them into the system in the first place, but if you're on the outside thinking you'll see the warning signs of a potential threat, guess again. Maybe that's why they were able to commit their crimes in the first place, holding an uncanny ability to hide the evil living inside them. If that's true, then I don't know what advice I can give you to help you spot it. All I can say is that when I looked into a place I was sure to find hell, it just wasn't there. And that, in itself, frightens me more than anything. Chapter 3. While serial killers might be seen as the kind of monsters walking around these halls, they definitely aren't the only ones who give me reason to shudder. Serial killers generally take their time to plan their murders or rapes, spending days or even weeks following a victim, stalking their prey until they feel ready to strike. They stand at the very heart of terror, with most of us having grown up with names of some of the worst. But while they certainly command a very high level of evil, they weren't the ones who scared me the most. That honor would go to those who committed their murders in the blink of an eye, ending their victims in the spur of the moment. These were the totally unpredictable threats who walk around our station, or who go off tap when they don't get their own way. The majority of these kinds of guys often killed a partner in the heat of the moment, maybe unable to deal with an argument or a breakup the way the rest of us might. Their tempers run hot the majority of their time, their fuses shorter than a matchstick. They also tend to be the ones most likely to shirt front an officer in the hopes of getting their way through intimidation. So many of these guys come to mind, and it's hard to pick any one individual. A part of me believes that their temper is perhaps the only part of their former selves they still feel familiar, and so they guard it with everything they have, not afraid to let it out to play at every opportunity. The worst part is, for those on life sentences, or at least 25 years plus or more, they live their lives as if they have nothing to lose. The end of their sentences, if they have one, is sometimes so far in the future, it probably feels out of reach. Those are the guys with very little to lose, not afraid to throw a few punches in order to get what they want. Quick-tempered crooks don't fear much, or at least not what they're willing to share. I'm sure deep down, they hold just as much fear as the rest of us. The difference is, they don't hide behind those fears. When I think back to every assault which took place on an officer, these were the guys most likely to be involved, driven by something deeper than just anger. For some, the driving force might have been a fear of being seen as weak. Trust me when I say that there is probably nothing worse for both prisoners and officers alike being seen as weak. For officers, it can mean an extremely difficult career, as every crook imaginable comes calling for favors through intimidation. For the crooks, it can be a virtual death sentence, endlessly getting beaten by anybody wanting to prove themselves. For others, the driving force behind the assaults could sometimes be put down as fear itself, the kind which they would never openly admit to. I've listened in on plenty of officer conversations where a recent assault was the main topic. A common explanation for tough guys lashing out for no apparent reason at all is the alternative exit method. Just like there is always a bigger fish in the ocean, there's one glaring problem with tough guys. There's always someone bigger, meaner, stronger, crazier than they are. They may not be in the unit, but that's not to say they mightn't turn up tomorrow or next week. The problem with being top dog is that someone will always want the title, and that means challenging for it. It's a common thing between alpha males, and in prison, it doesn't always end as well as one might hope for. For those with a little too much confidence on the line, there isn't really an easy way out. I've seen a crook take out 3 officers, leaving 2 in hospital just to get a ticket out of the unit. He just wanted to bail, was something I heard far too often, and became the stuff of nightmares. It made any and every shift completely unpredictable because there was no way of knowing who wanted out. There was no way a prisoner with a status in the unit would ever openly come up to the officer station and ask for a transfer to another unit because he felt afraid. If the request was made at all, it would be to a single officer and always behind closed doors. And those were so rare, they sounded more as myths than facts. I remember one shift where I nearly came to blows for no apparent reason, simply sitting in the station and minding my own business. The crook called out to me from an upstairs cell, already reason for an alarm. Crooks only ever call out for a single reason: to get attention. They want as many eyeballs on them as possible, so that whatever the plan is, it gets the views of the unit and shows how manly they really are. He was screaming about something to do with needing a new cell because of his ankle and his inability to climb stairs. I had only come into the unit as a replacement for one of the other staff to go to lunch, and this idiot thought he'd take advantage and arc up. The thing to remember is, crooks hold 24 hours a day of free time in their hands. How they fill them is entirely up to them. For some, the answer is endless activities to make the time go quicker. The gymnasium, the unit fitness equipment, using yard time to get some miles under their belt. Then there's work, with each inmate able to put their hand up for one of several factories open to them. There's the kitchen, the laundry, the maintenance crew. Let's not forget about the educational side of things, with multiple courses on offer, a library, and several religious figures on hand. But what do you do when you're too angry to do any of those? Or you're more interested in making a name for yourself and prefer climbing the ladder of power inside the unit? The pecking order is something quite lucrative when near the top, and is quite prestigious to those in that mindset. What those inmates like to do is find new and ingenious ways of building their standing amongst the inmate population, and one way of doing that is to use officers for entertainment. The people in uniform are often the ones who end up facing the wrath of prisoners. This can be purely for entertainment purposes, but also has a tendency to include very serious consequences for those finding themselves in the middle of a full frontal attack. I say people because for us, both men and women don the uniform and take up posts inside units. The guy screaming at me from the top tier knew I had almost no history in the unit. I'd escorted a few crooks in and out of the place, sure. Had also worked a couple of shifts here and there. But working in that unit full-time in order to understand the way things operated, he knew the answer was no. Worse still, one of the other staff members had been in one of the side offices meeting with a supervisor, while the other had gone out into the yard to find a crook summoned up for a urine test at admissions. We tried to page him over the PA system, but he didn't respond, either not hearing us or choosing to ignore the page. This left me sitting in the officer's station alone, a single set of eyes to watch close to 50 maximum security prisoners at once. Do you want to know how to see whether you have the balls to work inside a maximum security prison unit filled with the kind of monsters you hear about in the nightly news? Sit in the middle of the common area with absolutely no protection and no weapons, with 50 of them unlocked and walking around freely. If you want to add an extra layer of fear, Google the term prison shivs, and then check out the images. While I'm sitting amongst them completely unarmed, I know that a number of those very weapons will be walking around me, hidden inside pockets and ready to be pulled out and used without hesitation. Consequences from officers isn't a word many prisoners think about when under the eyes of fellow inmates. It is, however, a word at the forefront of their brain when it comes to their fellow crooks sitting in judgment. The repercussions for not considering consequences is where true pain lies. Ramifications for showing weakness, not following orders to attack someone, or being suspected of snitching to guards is not something anybody really comes back from. There I was, sitting in the middle of the unit with just open space for protection between me and a possible attack. I promise you, my butthole puckered tight more than a few times as I felt the unit turn their attention to what I would do. This was one of those situations where the consequences for my own reaction weighed heavily on me. Show weakness, and I would become a target. Show aggression, and this could turn physical in a heartbeat. And that was definitely a situation I didn't want to provoke. Quick thinking has always been one of the most powerful tools for officers. That, and the ability to talk oneself out of any situation. Dialogue alone has probably saved more officers from injury and death than anything else. Combined with the ability to listen, you have yourself a pretty powerful combination with which to defend yourself. When I heard him begin to shout about struggling to climb the stairs, I immediately understood him to have some type of injury. If that injury proved to be significant, it meant he would be entitled to some sort of medical exemption, but only if given by a doctor. "I hear you," was how I began. You'd be surprised at just how powerful those 3 words can be. Not only do you acknowledge his words, but you also show him that you're listening. Unfortunately, too many officers, especially new ones, fail to properly understand the true role of a prison guard. They come in all fired up and ready to prove their toughness, when all that is needed is a little less confrontation and a bit more understanding. "Have you got your exemption from the doctors?" I didn't scream it. I didn't want to sound like a smartass, and certainly kept my own aggression down to a minimum. "No, the fucking screw won't make the appointment." And there it was. The answer to what could have turned this situation completely on its head. I didn't know which guard he was speaking of, and it didn't really matter. Now that I knew his issue, I could take care of it myself. Whether he actually had a sore ankle was irrelevant. and so was whether a spare cell on the lower tier existed. For all I knew, he could have been trying to intimidate me into giving up a ground-level cell in the 5 minutes I was alone. Maybe it had worked during a previous attempt. I don't know. But once I got him to the station and took his emails, I made a call to medical and booked him in for an appointment later that afternoon. He was happy with that and limped back up the stairs to his cell. The thing is, I don't know what happened from there. I don't even know whether he went. As far as that crook was concerned, I'd done what I said I was going to do. I didn't brush him aside, ignore his needs, or disrespect him the way he might have hoped for. I gave him no excuse and simply followed protocol. Others handle such situations differently, and each officer will follow what they believe the right course of action is. Unfortunately, crooks will always try and take advantage whenever possible, not just for gaining a single or ground floor cell, but so many other things as well. Extra meals, extra rations, extra time during visits, replacement uniforms, extra runners, new socks and jocks, even a new ID card. The thing is, sometimes an officer needs to recognize the monsters for what they truly are. The second I walk inside the prison's front doors, I'm already on alert, always aware of what's going on around me. And when I finally come face to face with anyone in green, I know that sometimes all that's needed for someone to get hurt is the tiniest bit of complacency. And when you're walking around a place where the real monsters exist, complacency is something which will kill you. Chapter 4. Not all monsters are murderers, and not all of them end up with life sentences. Spend any night locked up in Murray North and listen to the endless screaming between crooks, and you quickly understand how some monsters manage to camouflage themselves into a crowd. During my time inside, I met a lot of different types of prisoners, and it often amazed me how different they were, not only in an individual kind of way, but also how a lot of them could be categorized. Remember how I said life inside is more like an endless game when compared to the outside world? For some, this means never deviating from the persona they hold on to while inside. It might be that they feel a need to create as much havoc as possible, always needing to be the center of attention, in which case they go out of their way to begin drama. These are the guys who maintain the persona even when alone in a separated area, with only officers watching on. You know how some people in life hate cops no matter what? Regardless of who the officer is under the uniform, to these guys, it's completely irrelevant. Once they see the uniform, it's all tunnel vision, the hatred fueled like an oil fire. That's how some crooks see prison officers. No matter who they are, or what officers do for them, they will never drop the walls they keep up for prison guards. I've seen that kind of hatred in plenty of eyes, and it's real. But then, on the opposite side, are those inmates who only put on a show when they're surrounded by other prisoners. These are the ones playing the game, needing to act a certain way in order to fit in, but then dropping the fake facade the second they're alone. I've also met plenty of these guys over the course of my career. The easiest way to pick them out is to engage with them on a one-on-one. They tend to be completely different people. The monsters I would focus my attention on were the first kind, and boy, did we have our work cut out for us. These were the kinds of inmates who would turn an ordinary shift into a 12-hour nightmare, an endless headache leaving a person with temporary brain damage at the end of a shift. The first thing they would do is try and be as demanding as possible. From the moment they entered a room, the very air would thicken with tension. Because prison is simply a repetition of the same faces each day, only 1 or 2 out of close to 2,000 would end their sentences on any given day. It meant staff knew each and every person who fronted the line. Whether waiting for their medication, a medical appointment, a visit, an escort, meals, or any other number of situations, these guys would make it their mission to ensure the time they spent under the watchful eye of staff was as annoying and uncomfortable as humanly possible. The loud voice, the obnoxious comments, the lack of manners, the blunt demands, the refusals to follow simple commands. It all added up to one massive pain in the arse, and boy, do they love it. These were the people new officers hated the most, because it meant stepping out of their comfort zones to get them back under control. The level of disrespect these guys can show at times, just for the sake of getting a laugh from their mates, is something off the scale. Consequences isn't a word they tend to adopt into their vocabulary, and to give you an idea of just how bad they can get, there was a court case I watched on television a few years ago. 3 guys had been pulled into the Supreme Court to answer fresh charges, with all of them already doing time in maximum security. One is in for murder, already serving a life sentence. Let me tell you, guys like that, they know they don't have much more to lose, so hitting them with an extra sentence to run concurrently with their current ones doesn't really mean much. For a normal, law-abiding citizen who values their freedom and owns enough morals and dignity to get through life, the footage from that court case is actually quite disturbing. It left me shaking my head more than a few times. In the video clips, the trio were filmed shouting out insults to the judge, repeatedly interrupting proceedings and laughing about it amongst themselves. To them, it was one huge joke, mocking the prosecutor, the lawyers, and anyone else unlucky enough to be part of the case. These guys didn't have a care in the world. Threats of extra punishments went completely ignored, with the trio treating their time in court as some sort of stand-up routine. It honestly blew me away, and I'd seen more than my fair share of similar acts inside. Seeing it happen in such an official capacity was just shocking. While these kinds of guys may not appear to be the types of monsters you might have imagined when you first began reading, they are every bit as unpredictable as those you fear. I've seen how they treat prison, which at times appears more like a holiday camp for them. When you think about a prisoner getting sentenced to a term in jail, how do you picture the sequence of events playing out? Is it like this? They're standing in court. The judge or magistrate sentences them. The defendant gets all worked up, pissed off, angry, begins abusing everyone around them, and security step in to escort them to prison. They break down in their cell, cry, scream, rage at anyone and everyone, and eventually get delivered, kicking and screaming, into prison. This might be how it happens to a rare few. But what if I told you that most of the time, it's the complete opposite? For many, it's nothing more than a routine they've gone through a dozen times before. They're all smiles along the way, going through each step in the process like a seasoned regular. Their details already exist in the system, which makes processing them so much easier, and it's normally nothing but a quick tick and flick to get them inside. Along the way, they might greet a few people here or there, but again, that's nothing compared to what happens next. I've been in units when these kinds of guys first arrive into them after being out for a while. A certain sense of excitement fills the air as they step through the airlock, with other crooks running to welcome him back. There's the backslapping, the high fives, the questions of, "What did you do this time?" From a distance, it almost appears as if the new arrival is about to ride the shoulders of his new neighbors to whatever cell he's assigned. A genuine hero's welcome, you might say. It's almost sickening to watch when you imagine prison supposedly being this magic deterrent we all believe it is. Watching this kind of sequence happen again and again certainly makes me wonder how much prison actually deters these guys. It's called a revolving door, and for some, means exactly that. They treat prison as their home, their usual way of life. I've seen it time and time again, guys preferring the inside of a cell to the outside. Why? Because for them, the life inside is what they not only see as normal, but is also much easier than what's open to them on the outside. I guess, in a way, it makes perfect sense. On the outside, there's the never-ending pressure of needing money to pay rent, utilities, bills, food, and whatever else they need. And yet, on the inside, everything is provided for them free of charge. And then there's their social standing to remember. For many, their prison reputation is something they've built up over time. It might be based on fear or intimidation. Others might gravitate towards them because they offer a certain level of protection, a person to pull in the troops and give them strength in numbers. They're part of the unit structure, a member of the upper pecking order, one of the top alphas, or any number of possible positions inside the social structure. On top of that, they receive their 3 square meals a day, all the medical and dental requirements they need, utilities, social calendar, access to a gymnasium, an educational portal if they choose. They're surrounded by friends, live rent-free, and have everything they need provided to them free of charge. I've heard one inmate explain it like this, and it almost saddened me in a way. Not for him, but for us as a society. How can we get it so wrong? The way he explained it makes so much sense from his perspective. To him, life inside a prison was what he considered normal. It was where he had his friends, his job. He worked in one of the factories during his usual stays, and those he considered his family. He had no financial pressures, with everything taken care of for him. Whatever he needed, the system provided for him. For him, getting released was what he saw as a holiday or vacation. Each time he'd finished another sentence, he had the chance to go out into the world and fulfill the rest of his needs during a quick trip out. He'd spend time with women and hit the gear pretty hard. And then once he had his fill and the stresses began to build up, he'd go and commit some sort of crime and get himself sent back to start the sequence all over again. The revolving door is very real, and for many, the ideal opportunity at a life the rest of us see as completely unbelievable. These are the monsters who break into your home to steal the belongings you yourself worked so hard for. They're the ones who come into your home to terrorize you or steal your car, either while it's parked somewhere or through violent carjackings. They're the ones who need quick money to buy their drugs and don't care about who they hurt to get it. Local businesses will normally find themselves targeted for theft, and if caught, will often find these people turn on them in confrontations serious enough to warrant another prison sentence. Before I worked inside a prison, I had a very similar picture to what many others have about the place. The inmates hated being inside, always on the lookout for ways to get out via escape attempts, living a life of utmost misery. I think it's a belief so many of us hold on to so that we can forget about criminals completely, hoping their existence is miserable enough as they pay for their crimes with years of endless misery. I know it certainly helped me sleep better at night. Unfortunately, that is no longer the image I have when I do think about it. Actually, it's nothing like the way I used to think of the place. Knowing what I know now, I wonder how a system like ours can ever truly work to achieve its main purpose. Isn't prison supposed to be a deterrent? And once inside, prisoners given the treatment needed for rehabilitation? Names like John Burns, Toby Manning, and others come to mind when I think about the kind of crooks who treated the prison's front gate like a revolving door. But they could be forgiven for their repeated offenses. They're what you'd call mentally challenged, with no proper place to go for the kind of specialist help they need. And while a lot of their episodes inside drove most officers up the wall, they did add a certain sense of character to the place. Whenever guards mentioned their names, the looks of disgust and sheer terror is enough to draw a smile from those watching. But then, there were different types of prisoners who fit more in line with the word monster than the unfortunate souls from Macquarie Unit. One such name is Jason Briggs. His name and face is something I still shudder at today. He's not what I'd call an overly friendly fellow, and his appearance is enough to make most people cross the road to get as far away as possible. This was the kind of guy who lived for trouble. His entire life revolved around hating cops, refusing to follow any sense of the law. This was a guy who came from a family of convicted criminals, and nothing was ever going to make him see the other side of life. I first met Briggs during my first couple of months inside, and from the very first moment, knew he was one of the ones I needed to keep an eye on the most. On the day I first met him, I'd still been on my induction course. This particular day had been set aside for us to shadow officers around certain units, with both Russell Tully and I assigned to Tambo West for the day. It also happened to be one of my first ever shadows, so I was already on edge to begin with. The first few minutes in any unit shadow are always the worst, and when the officers finally unlock the cells for the day and dozens of crooks begin to emerge into the common area, the nerves can reach fever pitch. I swear, the butthole had never quite puckered as hard as it did that morning. At the time, Tambo West had one of the worst reputations in the prison, a fact I noticed almost immediately from the look of the unit's clientele. Don't judge a book by the cover is something I've heard time and again. Or how about, don't judge a person by their looks? I've tried to live my life by both those sayings, but the thing is, in this place, you already know they're the worst of the worst. Think about where I'm standing. When a guy comes out looking all mean and ready to throat punch me for simply wearing a uniform, you know you have your work cut out. His facial tattoos only add to the intimidation, and Jason Briggs had enough facial tattoos to fill a comic book. As I stood in the officer's station, I could feel eyes on me, but none felt as intimidating as his. The rest of the crooks only seemed intrigued by a new face in the unit. My instructor had told us several times that it doesn't take long for new officers to be known around the prison. They don't see a lot of new faces walking around, and when they do, everyone wants to know who the person is. Briggs was different. His inquisitive eyes bore through me like lasers, the disdain enough to leave little doubt about how he truly felt about me. Thankfully, I didn't see much of him that day. Within an hour of being unlocked, he, along with a dozen others, headed to work in one of the factories. By the time he returned, I was already long gone. If I never saw him again, it would have been fine by me. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be. A couple of months after graduating the course and starting my career in admissions, Briggs again crossed my path when he returned to our prison. In all honesty, I didn't know he'd left, but according to the indent, each prisoner's personal notes holding all the information needed by admissions staff, he'd been out for 3 months, released after serving 18 months for aggravated assault, intimidation, plus possession of stolen goods. His charges didn't surprise me, but when I looked at his history, found the classic revolving door schedule. Considering other prisoners' indent similarities, I could see how that kind of analysis would have fit perfectly. Except Briggs isn't that type of prisoner. He's far worse than that. Someone involved in a violent world filled with gangs, drugs, and control. He wasn't back because he missed his friends and needed a routine set out for him. He was back because he'd been caught for another violent crime spree. From the moment Briggs stepped off the bus, things turned south. His demands for extra food, to jump the queues so he could get to his unit, as well as his actual unit allocation, all proved a challenge. Standing at around an even 6 foot, with his shoulders almost as wide, his appearance added a significant amount of intimidation to each and every interaction, and I had the pleasure of being the one to interview him during his initial arrival. I can't say it was an easy process, but if nothing else, it did give me an experience like no other. This was a classic arrogant prisoner displaying all the hallmarks of self-importance. He not only knew his rights, but he also knew how to play the game, more than aware of what he needed to do to get his own way. "You're off to Campaspe," I said as I picked up his file to begin the interview. The officer running the desk had already stuck a little post-it note on the front, identifying the unit allocation. "Not gonna happen," he said, as he shoveled a forkload of fried rice in. Bits spat across his lap, his eyes never leaving the container of food. "You have issues with Campaspe?" We had our own rules and regulations to stick to, and none of them allowed for us to change unit allocation because of someone's bad attitude. Only a supervisor could make the call, and even then it took an interview, as well as a call to the accommodation allocation team. This normally meant a deep dive into the prisoner's background. Prisoners weren't placed into the nearest spare cell. A process needed to be followed to ensure the safety of not only the inmate being sent to a unit, but also the inmates already living inside it. Background checks, including finding any possible red flags between inmates, no matter how far back they go. Things like previous debts, previous assaults, family relatives, previous gang affiliates, and dozens of other links need to be checked before a prisoner could be given a bed in a unit. When arrogant prisoners like Briggs begin throwing their temper tantrums around, it's enough to piss everybody off. The thing is, everybody knows the outcome even before it begins. Briggs knows the outcome. I know the outcome. The supervisor knows the outcome. Hell, even the tactical guys know the outcome when they eventually respond to the code, which we all know is inevitable. It begins simple enough, with me advising Briggs that I need to call the soup down to address his concerns. "Then get him the fuck down here," the crook shouts, dropping his empty food container into the bin as he stands up. "I'll wait in the cell." Given his rise in temper, his willingness to return to the cell is the best thing to come out of his mouth. It means I can isolate him, and should he try and kick things up another level, the advantage will be firmly on our side of the door. Unfortunately, Briggs also knows this. The reason he willingly returns to the cell is because he knows that once the door is closed, it frees him up to begin really going to town on his demands to go to his choice of unit. And where do you think he wants to go? Let's see if you've been paying attention throughout the previous books. Where do you think Briggs wants to go? If you think you know, then the answer shouldn't come as a surprise to you. When first arriving into the prison and subsequently walking into a unit, 90% of crooks end up in a shared cell. It's just the way things are. For one, prison overpopulation is as common as finding rats in the basement. It's just the way it is. With crime continuing to go faster than the state is able to build new units, a lot of former single cells have been turned into dual occupancy, or in some cases, even 3 outers. Single cells definitely exist, but they rarely become available, and even then are definitely not an entitlement. For a prisoner to go from a two-outer into a single cell, he needs to be on a certain behavioral level to qualify, as well as have his name on the list and reach the top. Most infractions in the unit will cause the name to slide down the list, with some offenses canceling it completely. Briggs knew that if he went to Campaspe, his arse would not be going to sleep alone that night. He would be in with either one or two guys, unable to take a shit until the next morning's unlock. Even with attitude, the chance of scoring a single cell was virtually zero. So, he would opt for a unit where he knew the majority of the crooks, perhaps try and score a bunk in a cell with a previous collie, or even with one of his former crew. Again, guys like Briggs don't willingly bunk with anybody unless they absolutely had to, and given the way he began kicking the shit out of the door not 2 minutes after I closed it, I knew he had no intention of going in that direction. The soup arrived around 10 minutes after I called him over the radio, and I gave him an update down the hall a bit. The banging of Briggs kicking the steel door reverberated around the place enough to burst eardrums. Stick your head in a metal trash can, get someone to smack the shit out of it with a baseball bat, and you'll get the idea of what I mean. All right, let's have a chat with him, shall we? Eugene Turner flashes me a wink, and I follow him towards the source of the noise. It takes Briggs a couple of seconds to notice the viewing flap open. He has his back turned to the door, leaning against it and kicking it backwards. Turner finally gets his attention by punching the door when the kicking pauses. "Get me the fuck out of here," Briggs screams at the viewing window. Turner knows his job well. He also knows every game crooks try to play, having witnessed hundreds of them throughout his career. To him, listening to Briggs felt like a broken record. And I don't know why, but he stopped the game before it could really get going. You're not going to Murray North, no matter how much you kick the door in. Open the fucking trap, dog, and we'll see about that. Turner just grinned. The only place you're going is to Campaspe, and right now, it's a choice between your assigned cell and the observation cell. If it's the obso, your shit stays here, and the tactical team will drag your arse down there. The rest of us simply stood back and listened in as Briggs went to town, calling the soup every derogatory name under the sun. He resumed kicking the door with added enthusiasm. Jim Kruger is standing a few feet behind us, his hands clamped over his ears as he shoots me a grin. Words aren't needed for us to know what each other are thinking. This exact game plays itself out so many times each week, it's a miracle anybody still thinks it's going to work. Briggs certainly isn't the first crook to play this game, and all of us know he won't be the last. When the tactical guys decide to pay him a visit a few minutes later to ask whether he's willing to cooperate, he knows the game is over. Fuck up now, and Turner's threat becomes real. He knows it, and responds accordingly. I'll go. 4 large lads in blue let him out of the cell, wait so he can grab his things, then walk him out of the building. The look on his face is as blank as the piece of paper I was holding. Like I said, it's a game where everybody knows the possible outcomes. Whoever flinches first loses. By sending the tactical lads to visit the cell, Turner took himself out of the equation, leaving Briggs alone to make the decision which would determine the outcome. In this place, monsters come in all shapes and sizes. They don't always look like what you might expect, and sometimes that's exactly how they appear. Sit back as I take you to a place where some of the darkest live, the kind who would do just about anything without a valid reason as to why. Chapter 5. Welcome to the psych ward, a place where the criminals locked inside really do resemble the kinds of monsters you might imagine. There's a scene from a movie which played in my mind the very first time I found myself assigned to this particular area of the prison. Do you remember the bit where Clarice Starling first visits Dr. Lecter in prison, and she slowly walks along the right side of the corridor while the cells sit against the left side? That's exactly how I imagined it. Imagine my disappointment when I walked into this place and found something almost mirrored to most of the other units in the jail. While there was no second-floor tier to speak of, the rest of it looked pretty much the same, complete with officer station. The only difference with this station was that it sat against one wall, which had a single door leading through to where the psych nurses sat. Around 40 cells lined the rest of the walls, spread out in a kind of fat V shape, with the station located in the very bottom to ensure officers had a clear view in both directions. Instead of steel mesh fencing, which circled the other yards, this one had nothing but sheet metal, keeping the inmates as separated from the outside world as much as possible. These were the kind of guys who'd want to spend hours talking to people, and the fence ensured even their field of vision remained limited. But the unit layout isn't what I brought you here for. Its design isn't really significant except for one minor detail. Running alongside the station, 3 observation cells sit against an opposing wall, the doors close enough to where the officers sit for even whispers to reach them. It was these 3 cells which would become the stuff of nightmares for some officers, with the crooks held in them, some of the most painful to visit the unit. Observation cells serve 2 purposes. The first is the most obvious, its purpose already mentioned in the name. It's used to observe prisoners via a CCTV camera fixed inside the cell, as well as the viewing window set into the door. Some units' observation cells go one step further by having split doors, comprised of an inner door made up of thick, clear perspex to keep a proper visual watch over inmates, as well as a thin outer skin, which would be closed to offer a degree of privacy. Let me tell you right from the beginning, the inner CCTV camera created more problems than it was worth at times. Whoever designed the cells failed to miss one minor key ingredient during their extensive collaboration on what each cell needed. Prisoners would be kept inside, and by prisoners, I mean the uncooperative kind who love nothing more than make life as difficult as possible for the guards assigned to watch them. I've been on duty where a non-compliant crook has been dragged to the cell and thrown inside, and then watched as they grabbed the nearest bit of toilet paper, dunked it into the toilet water, and slapped it over the lens, efficiently cutting off our view. To make matters worse, if said crook had also been assigned a suicide ranking, it meant we needed to keep physical watch of them, which ultimately led to a standoff, leaving us officers left with no choice but to begin negotiations. Oh, the humanity. Thankfully, most of the crooks weren't quite so bad. It certainly paid to lose any attitude when dealing with a particularly vocal crook, as they would be sitting less than 6 feet from where you were spending either the day or night. I've saved myself plenty of screwed-up night shifts with a single cup of coffee. Where things get interesting is when the night shift ends. The morning crew show up and the morning muster is called correct. What follows is the unlocking of 40 cells, with a large number of psychiatrically evaluated inmates let loose on the day staff. This is where it pays to have a couple of well-versed psych nurses on hand. How smooth the day will run can often be determined by who shares the shift with you. Firstly, the officers themselves will influence the direction of the day. If there's a virtual flamethrower on shift, you know it's bound to be a tough one. But it's the psych nurses who also influence the outcome of the day, and that is because in this unit, every inmate requires constant supervision, as well as regular medication. When I say medication, I'm not talking about a couple of painkillers to ease a sore back from sleeping on a 4-inch chunk of foam. I'm talking the hard stuff, the little pills which make the voices stop. This is the stuff most of the unit need in order to get through the days without feeling an urge to rip someone's eyeballs out, which is why it pays for whoever is assigned to watch medication distribution to really pay attention. In this unit, incidents can go from 0 to batshit in 0.2 of a second. Brawls, stabbings, attempted self-harm. It's all part of the day when dealing with 40 inmates all singing the tune of medical suppression. And not everybody wants to willingly take their pills. Standovers happen as much in this unit as they do in any other, including going after someone's medication. Diversion happens in the blink of an eye, and all it takes is the slightest distraction for an officer to miss the slip of the hand or the tongue deflection, pushing the capsules or tablets into a corner of the mouth. For those who've mastered it, palming medication is just about the easiest thing for them, trained experts in the art of medicinal diversion. When I talk about monsters in this unit, have no doubt about what lives behind these walls. These are the men who've taken lives, often struggling with some sort of psychotic episode, which ultimately pushes them into horrific action. The guy who chopped his girlfriend into little pieces and buried her in the backyard. The one who cut his mother to pieces with a chainsaw. Or the one who murdered his children. If you want to experience a real sense of holy shit, try walking around this unit after lights out. I've done it, on many occasions, and I promise you that each time felt just as eye-opening as the first. Quietly walking around the unit and listening to these inmates going about their post-lockdown routines is like a small insight into their existence. I still remember my first ever night shift inside the place. Arriving early, I watched as the day staff went about the final few duties for their shift, finishing with the eventual lockdown muster. The crooks all tend to rush during the final 5 minutes, finishing some final errands before they were locked in for the night, saying goodnight to each other, grabbing something out of the microwave, getting a drink from the unit fridge. Too many things to watch as 40 of them run around like ants on a sugar mountain. Once control call count correct, it takes about 4 seconds for the day staff to flick me a quick goodnight before disappearing out through the door. In the first few seconds after the door closes behind them, the silence is almost physical, as if reaching for me with phantom fingers. I can hear a few sounds from behind the cell doors, but nothing to focus on. It took me almost 5 minutes to will my legs to move from the spot. First, killing the lights, then setting up the television for the night. I still hadn't reached the point of writing by then, and so most night shifts still consisted of nothing more than late-night TV. We didn't even have the internet, which meant reading emails only took up so much time. Strangely, I didn't need a lot of either that first night. The intrigue about where I was felt kind of overwhelming. The psych nurses remained in their office for the majority of the time, which left me to my own devices. It didn't take me long to succumb to the curiosity and go exploring. Each cell displayed the name of the prisoner sitting just behind the door, and as I slowly walked around the outside walls, I read each one, pausing when a familiar one jumped out at me. There I was, the only officer inside, and standing within just a few feet from men who at one point or another filled the nation's media with their stories. Just a single metal door separated me from them. I could have walked to the door and opened the trap, asked them any question I wanted to. Even just listening to them felt intriguing in a weird kind of way. I must have spent an hour just walking around and reading names that first night. Looking back on it now, I'm amazed the control room didn't call me and ask me what the hell I was doing. It didn't occur to me until much later that they would have had eyes on me, with several internal cameras watching the unit 24/7. If anyone had seen me, they would have made fun. I can just picture the crew I used to work with pointing at me as if a freak. To most, crooks were scum, the lowest life form imaginable, and to be treated as such. Treat the fuckers all the same is something I heard over and over again. Others would insist to give them what they were entitled to, but not everybody. Some officers simply refused to lower themselves enough for that. They wanted to make them suffer as much as possible, ignoring the laws we were supposed to live by. Can you blame them? Child killers, rapists, depraved psychotics who had unleashed living hell on their victims? Could anybody really blame officers for ignoring the most basic fundamental role of a prison officer? For many, the jury is still out on that one. For me, I did what I was required to do. I hope I don't sound like I'm preaching here, but I want to try and make a point. The immense pressure we worked under in that place, the incredibly confronting situations, the level of violence, the endless presence of real danger. It takes a lot of willpower and concentration to get through that. While some officers shrug it off and others grapple with it, I put it down to one thing, one single thought which I often reminded myself of. The purpose behind the prison itself is something which has to be fundamentally believed in. If a person didn't believe in its purpose, then how could they possibly perform the duties required of them? I knew that as long as I reminded myself of the why, then I would always know and understand the how. One of the monsters who I will never forget wasn't one who immediately stood out to me. His name meant nothing to me, and I doubt he appeared on the front page of any newspaper. And yet, for one person, he resembled the very essence of hell itself. The guy I'm talking about was a man who took pleasure in beating his girlfriend. Domestic violence was something Dylan Pierce practiced on a daily basis, keeping his victim isolated and alone, while dishing out the kind of horrors one can only imagine. Unfortunately for this guy, his partner had a brother, and when he found out about what was happening, he didn't take the news too well. I don't know the exact weapon he used, but he managed to beat the shit out of this guy so bad, his skull literally caved in, crushed beneath the flurry of blows. And while it didn't kill him, this was an attack Pierce would never come back from. Recovery was practically impossible. His existence turned into nothing more than a blanked-out stare as he walked around the place muttering to himself. He needed to wear a safety helmet full-time to protect the damage. Like I said, recovery wasn't something on the cards for him. This monster, as it seemed, had his wings clipped once and for all. But Pierce wasn't the only story I remember from the unit. So many more come to mind when I think back to those first few shifts and how their lives seem so separated from the rest of the prison. Like Macquarie, where the inmates are made up predominantly of disabled men, this place also felt more like a summer camp. Activities, both for entertainment and learning, consisted of things you might see in primary school. And yet the people participating in them could have skinned a person alive just for the pleasure. What's weird is that not everybody in the unit should have been there. In particular, a guy named Martin Bell. Bell just didn't fit the standard profile you might expect to see, and I should know, because I had a bit to do with this particular crook. He'd worked in admissions for a while, or at least until he was caught helping himself to various items and taking them back to his cell. When I first met Bell, he was in the middle of remand, detained for the murder of his partner. A murder, I might say, which wasn't kept behind closed doors. He'd stabbed her to death in the middle of a shopping center, witnessed by dozens of people, and yet he still pled not guilty, forcing a trial which lasted weeks. Right from the beginning, I could tell he was a player, an actor, someone who tried to get his own way by pretending. There was something creepy about the way he looked at you when he spoke, as if sizing up whether he could try and get one over you. Personally, I never had an issue with him, and whenever he saw me out in the prison, would always shoot me a wave. Around the unit, he looked like just another inmate, spending his days hanging out with friends, cleaning, or playing pool. I don't remember him ever getting into any sort of confrontations as such. Not with any of the other inmates, and not with the officers in charge of the unit. He mostly flew under the radar, and so nobody really noticed him. But that changed on one of the mornings of his trial. He'd been woken early by the guard on duty and told to get ready for his escort to admissions. In case you didn't know, every prisoner in the unit is considered protection, which means nothing but escorts wherever they needed to go. On this particular morning, he began complaining of a stomachache, saying he didn't feel well enough to attend court. This wasn't a choice he could make for himself, and when the soup was notified, he ended up being ordered to get ready. Now, the story gets a little hazy at this point, mainly because of the amount of times it has been retold, but the general gist is Bell tried to hang himself with a bed sheet. He had managed to wind it around his neck several times, and by the time the officer found him, Bell was lying on the floor in a daze. He wasn't passed out, and the red mark around his neck did look a little like it had been tightened. But Bell had no intention of killing himself that morning. He was trying to play the game, and the officer took one look at him and knew what the smirk he saw meant. Bell ended up getting taken to the medical unit, assessed by a doctor and psych nurse, and then classified as an S1 prisoner. He didn't attend court that day. Instead, he was promptly escorted to an observation cell, made to wear nothing but a canvas gown. Think of a heavy knee-high dress, but much less flattering. Given no belongings of any kind, and left alone while being monitored every 15 minutes. Did it bother him? Not initially. He got what he wanted, which was to remain in the prison and not front the courtroom. But it wasn't long after he would have been back from the day excursion that things began to change. I know, because I came on shift at 7 that night and found him still sitting in the obso cell. When I took my first peek in through the trap window, he was sitting on the floor with his back against the bunk. By 9 o'clock that night, he buzzed me, asking if I could get the doctor for him. I had already been pre-warned he might ask, and so was prepared. When he heard me say the doc had gone home for the night, I could see the disappointment through the CCTV, his shoulders drooping as he sat on the bed. There was a television in the room, but the sign taped to the front of his cell door also forbade me switching it on. The day soup had already told me about the first altercation between them and banned Bell from TV rights for 24 hours. The only request I granted him was switching the cell lights off at around 10. There literally was nothing to do, except sing, recite poetry, sleep, or just wank. I don't know which of the latter two he chose, but he certainly didn't choose the first two. Of that fact, I'm sure. The psych ward offered most a way out of mainstream or protection units where many more inmates live. It provided an almost sheltered environment where they could effectively hide away from the life they should have been living if left in their initial allocations. Not everybody is lucky enough to find a place to hide, like the inmates in the psych ward. For most, they have to take their chances out in the open hellhole of prison itself, where the only protection offered is the kind they pay for. The sad part is that not everybody who comes into prison is a monster. Sometimes it takes prison to turn them into one. Chapter 6. When it comes to the kinds of crimes which get people into maximum security, it might surprise you to learn that they don't always need to be the serious kind. Sure, we have murderers, rapists, drug gangs, and the rest of the ones you'd expect. But what if I told you we also hold fare evaders, fine dodgers, or something as simple as speeding? And then, what if I told you that not all prisoners are quite as old as you might think? There's a unit in our prison called Lachlan, specifically built to house 18 to 25-year-olds. The powers that be didn't want the younger age group mixing it up with the adult population, fearing they would get taken advantage of or singled out for assaults and rapes. They petitioned the government for a unit to allow these younger inmates to remain separated. The reason I haven't really mentioned this unit much before is because I never really worked in it. I'd searched it plenty of times during my night shift duties, but as for spending an entire day watching its occupants, never. But I have heard plenty of stories about the place, and it never ceases to amaze me when I hear about the hierarchy always conforming itself to the same way a normal prison unit does. The strong prey on the weak, and everybody hides it from the officers. There is one small issue with the unit, though. One minor matter which the powers that be seem to have overlooked when ordering its construction. The unit only holds 40 cells, and every cell is a single outer. That means just 40 crooks at a time have a bed in the place. And do you know what happens when all the beds are filled? You guessed right. When most crooks turn up to the prison for the first time, a certain sense of fear hangs around them, like an invisible field of energy everybody feels, but nobody mentions. With wide eyes, they constantly check their surroundings, jumping at each little sound, and find themselves unable to join in the humor when officers make a joke. That's how I saw grown-up new arrivals. The 18 and 19-year-olds are on another level entirely. These guys sometimes look more like 14-year-olds than 18. I doubt I've ever seen more fear in the face of someone besides any of these kids. A fart would have sent them jumping. When they stepped off the bus and fronted the line the first time, they knew they had made it to the big time. Their crimes mostly vary, anywhere from dangerous driving to vehicular manslaughter, assaults, and more. The one thing they all had in common was lack of life experience. Most of them ran on nothing more than the things they'd seen in movies and television shows, or worse still, shit their mates told them. A single moment in their life may have been enough to change the entire course of their future into a new direction. One dumb and stupid decision to try and impress a girl or save face to a complete stranger. You know the moments, the situations kids often find themselves in where the tough guy persona has to come out, just in case someone might see them as weak. It's those very insignificant moments which often end up having the most influence on their lives, ending with someone either severely injured or worse, even dead. It doesn't take much to land someone in prison, but boy, is it hard to get over it. The experience remains with you for life, and if the events happen so early on in life, I shudder whenever I see the revolving door happen to them. But that's not the point of this chapter. What I want to share is the path to becoming monsters. Still, not the kind you might think of when hearing infamous names, but certainly enough to warrant a reaction. It all depends on who they were to begin with, because there are so many different possibilities in this place. A young inmate has two paths they might follow when they first get here, and both could lead them into mainstream, surrounded by the worst of the worst. The first is the roundabout method. They come in at the right time and find themselves lucky enough to be located a cell in Lachlan. While initially quiet, They quickly find that they stand a chance of becoming the alpha in the group and begin making moves. For some, it may not even be about hierarchy. For some, just needing to make themselves look strong is reason enough to take risks. Eventually, they cross the line one too many times, maybe ignore a couple of official warnings from officers or the soup, and boom, they get kicked out of Laughlin and into mainstream. The second method is the direct way. This, unfortunately, is where poor planning comes in, and the inmate arrives at a bad time. Laughlin is filled to the brim, with no available cells in the place. Still classed as an adult, they find themselves allocated to a mainstream unit, entering the world of adult maximum security at the ripe old age of 18. Don't get me wrong, the powers that be don't just throw anybody anywhere they'll fit. There are still certain rules and regulations which need to be followed, as well as a ton of checks. I've seen kids who come in charged as adults get sent straight to protection units because of their vulnerability. But then again, I've also seen others go straight into places like Tambo West, a virtual Bronx within our walls. I remember one kid coming in looking very much like a young Justin Bieber, back in the day when he first popped onto the scene. The kid's voice hadn't even broken yet. He sported this very feminine blonde hair, which didn't help his cause one bit. The ribbing he copped from the officers when they processed his property was one for the memory banks. When I saw the same kid some weeks later, it took me a moment to recognize him. He'd literally shaved his head down to what American prisons call a murder one. Did he look scared? Hell yes. I wouldn't have wished my worst enemy to swap places with that young man. I have no doubt someone took him under their wing, shown him around, and begun teaching that young man the laws of the land inside. And that's where the monster is born, raised amongst those with nothing but bad intentions for them. These are the ones they mold into what they need, especially if they show some initiative and a hint of balls. The leaders, the alphas, whatever you want to call them, have plenty of volunteers for things like hits, contracts, intimidation, or just plain old entertainment. The young ones are who they train and shape into whatever they want them to be. Prison is supposed to be about reform, about rehabilitation, and for offenders to find the correct path in life. It is supposed to be about turning prisoners back into model citizens, isn't it? Whoever still believes that bullshit seriously needs to lose their rose-colored glasses and see what prison actually is. A simple answer to a complex problem, with the results often ignored in case they sour some election or news article. Sadly, there isn't a lot of hope for people thrown in jail these days, much less the weaker inmates unable to defend themselves. Their very survival depends on who they align with, and it's often the strongest they choose for the best protection. Is it then any wonder when they end up worse people than when they went in? I've seen inmates turn from wide-eyed, scared kids into shiv-wielding maniacs, meek-looking runts into muscle-bound thugs. When they say prison changes a man, boy, were they right. It changes a person in more ways than just physical appearance. It was a normal day back in 2019 when I came in for what should have been a simple patrol shift. It was the second of 3, and given the previous night had been fairly quiet, was hoping for much the same. The second I stepped through the main airlock and into the prison, I knew something was wrong. The moment I turned the radio on, voices shot information back and forth in rapid succession. It took me a few seconds to work out that Control was actively coordinating an ambulance with an on-site supervisor. An attack had occurred, much like dozens I had seen and heard about during my time inside. Despite arriving early for my shift like I always did, I hurried to the duty soup's office, found it closed, and stowed my gear in the staff room, Rather than sit around doing nothing, I ended up heading to the unit to see if there was anything I could do to help. The scene before me as I stepped through the airlock can only be described as horrific, a confronting picture of the kind of violence this place was more than capable of. The unit had already been locked down by the staff, two of whom were preparing for the lockdown muster. The third stood in the station behind the soup, who was sitting in front of the computer screen, no doubt busy trying to put things into writing for the managers. When I say there was blood, don't find yourself led astray by images of a small puddle on a vinyl floor. There was a puddle, yes, a small one, a few feet from a second, both joined by a line of dots, as if replicating speech bubbles. The further I rounded the officer station, the more of the carnage came to light, with the trail of blood following a skewed path around several tables, circling around the unit fridge, back around the pool table, and finally coming to the grand finale, a splatterfest of gore culminating into one large lake of nearly congealed blood. From the looks of it, I assumed it must have been a fight between several people, the blood leaking from more than one body as the brawl worked its way around the unit's common area. I'm no forensics expert, but it looked like a number of different trails heading in opposite directions. No wonder they're struggling to get ambulances here, I remember thinking to myself. I couldn't imagine the bedlam currently going on in the medical wing, where I assumed at least a dozen inmates must have been lying on stretchers. The truth turned out to be nothing even remotely to what I had imagined. The blood hadn't come from a dozen crooks, but just one. The trails had been him running from multiple attackers, each wielding a homemade shiv as they stabbed and sliced at him for almost 3 minutes. Because each of the attackers was armed, unit staff couldn't go in and break up the fight, instead ordered to remain in the station and wait for backup. By the time armed personnel arrived, the victim had managed to bleed himself across half the unit floor, evading his attackers as best he could using speed and agility. The reason for the fight was never determined, although it was surmised that he had gang affiliations on the outside, which somehow managed to work their way inside. Whatever the issue was, it nearly ended the crook's life, and given it happened in the middle of a monitored unit, 4 crooks were eventually hit with multiple charges. By the time they finally turned up, I ended up escorting the police into the prison and through to the unit. They remained for close to 2 hours, snapping enough photographs to fill more than a few albums. By the time they left again, the rest of the prison had already long gone to sleep, with just the night shift crew on duty. The youngest of those attackers was just 19, in on his first charge and due to go home in less than a month. He'd come in at a time when Laughlin's availability sat at 0, the only place left to send him being one of the protection units. It didn't take long for those sitting higher on the power chain to recruit him into their ranks, give him weapons and a couple of ultimatums. Long story short, they managed to turn a kid in for a few months into someone capable of committing murder. The only thing which saved him from a possible life sentence was the fact the victim survived the attack. Despite a couple of dozen stab wounds, he managed to cling to life long enough for the doctors to save him. For us, it was just another night in maximum security. But it's not just the young ones who end up falling victim to the older population. There is another group of prisoners who often find themselves on the receiving end of the kind of treatment which turns them into monsters. This group is the kind most of us are familiar with, because they remind us of when we faced the wrath of bullies. Chapter 7. Have you ever heard the expression, "It's the quiet ones you have to watch"? It's a pretty common saying, which more than likely comes from the fact that a lot of serial killers tend to be introverts, often described as quiet and shy. Some speculate that it's because of this social awkwardness that they tend to isolate themselves and eventually lash out at the world for ignoring them. Prison is filled with so many personalities that it's often a showcase of experiences a person will have when interacting with them all. You have your attention seekers, the ones always needing eyes on them, clamoring for popularity to feed their need for self-validation. These also tend to be some of the funniest crooks around, always hoping for a laugh to gain the acceptance of peers. Next, you have the tough guys. You know who these are, always hanging around the gym equipment, constantly pumping themselves up, and then following up their workout with several laps of the unit, their arms hanging as wide as possible because of their enormously outrageous shoulders. These guys are also the ones often fighting their way to the very top of the food chain and most likely to get into confrontations. Then you have the adapters, the ones you might know better as sheep. These guys suffer from a distinct lack of self-confidence and character, which, when combined, robs them of any sort of identity. Instead, they align themselves with one of the tough guys. Think of it more as protection than anything else. Pretend to be like them, and eventually turn into one of the lower-ranked hitters sent in to intimidate others. There are also the celebrities, the crooks with the headlines and the coverage to ensure most already know of them long before they even show up. A lot of these guys end up in isolation, normally somewhere like Murray North or South, where they spend their time safely segregated for their own protection. It's these guys who often find themselves targeted by those wanting to make a name for themselves, hence their need for separation. Age doesn't really tend to differentiate any inmates. Sure, the older ones might move a little slower, but I've seen them fire up just as quick as some hothead. The young ones don't always need very long to adapt to their new lifestyle, sometimes learning the ropes a little too well in order to fit in. But there is a group who don't fit in, like ever, and that's the quiet ones. Every now and then we get a crook in who just doesn't appear right, not in a physical way, but more so with the energy surrounding them, their demeanor. They hang back in lines, don't talk very much, and nearly always lack the input others have in conversations. They tend to sit alone in communal waiting rooms, are the last to walk out of a room, the last to reach for a meal, the ones least likely to ask for anything from officers. They're just quiet. The problem comes from others perceiving quietness with weakness. And if there's something I learned over time, it's that there's hardly ever anything weak about the quiet ones. Push them hard enough, and they'll bite back, almost always just as hard as the rest of them. They simply take a little more to get going. William Bolton is what I considered a quiet one. He wasn't much to look at, almost skinny enough to take flight with a slight breeze. But he stood quite tall, well over 6 feet, and that brought him up to eye level with some of the worst bullies in the joint. The day I met him was when he first stepped off the bus at our prison, part of almost a dozen prisoners to turn up from the city jail. There wasn't anything striking about the man, nothing to highlight him or set him apart from the rest of the crew he arrived with. He followed instructions without question, slipped quietly into a holding cell with 4 others, and patiently waited his turn. When I brought a tray of lunch packs around, he was the last to take one. I remember him in particular because there weren't enough plastic forks to go around. When I told him through the trap window that I'd be back shortly, he hardly moved. It was the eyes, you see. Eyes which never quite met the moment between us. When I returned, he was still standing on the other side of the trap and simply took the fork I held out. He didn't say anything, just turned and went back to his place on the seat. I initially wondered whether he would be the kind of guy to need extra time with a psych nurse, possibly due to struggling with his new surroundings. We had heaps like that, often considering ending it all because of how they viewed their future. Bolton sat patiently in the cell until I summoned him out of it and walked him to the interview desk where I began processing him. He sat quietly, face sullen, hands in his lap as he answered each of my questions in turn, the tone flat and disinterested. But his eyes were what I remember most, not once meeting mine, no matter how many questions I asked of him. They remained fixed on a spot on the desk between us, but that isn't quite the right description. The direction might have been towards that spot, but that definitely wasn't where they fixed. My guess was the stare he sent out continued traveling for many miles into the nether, somewhere in the distance where I couldn't reach him. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't incoherent or spaced out or anything. He just wasn't there with me. He was just quiet. Perhaps it was his way of dealing with the situation, or he was one of those guys who simply lived his life misunderstood by the rest of the world. His charges weren't anything outrageously spectacular, but the kind I almost expected to see. Aggravated assault topped the list, with a couple of related charges underneath. This was his first ever serious offense and his first time in prison, held on remand until his court date a month in the future. The cell set aside for him was in Tambo West, which meant he would have a significant introduction to prison life. I initially figured he'd be able to cope with the unit, but after returning him to the cell to wait for the next part of the process, I headed to the soup to run the situation past him. "He'll be fine," was the answer I received. I didn't really expect anything different. With no history and no known issues with anybody else in the unit, there was no reason not to send him. This was, after all, prison. I continued processing more prisoners and didn't see him at the subsequent points in the process. But I did spot him briefly as he was led out of admissions a couple of hours later, following 3 other crooks who were led by one of our own officers. The same distance his eyes had throughout our interview remained. To be honest, there isn't a lot of opportunity to dwell on certain prisoners when working day shift, not when you're in admissions. It's a place where the soles of your shoes tend to wear out far quicker than most other roles, and for good reason. I didn't really think much about Bolton after that day. There were always more where he came from, and the endless procession of new arrivals continued each and every day. It wasn't until around 3 weeks later that his name crossed paths with me again, this time during the start of a weekend night shift. As soon as I reached the duty soup's office, he asked me to go and take over watching a crook in the medical unit from the day staff. Their shift would end in the next 10 minutes or so, which meant one of the night shift crew needed to take over. When I reached the room in the medical wing, the crook lying on the bed didn't look familiar, but he certainly looked like someone had gone to town on him. He had one hand cuffed to the bed rail and appeared zoned out on whatever the nurse had given him. Before they left, the 2 day staff shared the situation with me. An ambulance had already taken another crook to hospital, with a third already repaired and taken to Murray North. From what I could gather, the one taken to hospital and the inmate laying on the bed before me attacked the third. According to the day crew, they ambushed him out in the yard. The attack lasted almost a minute, but by the time staff arrived, the attacker had taken care of business, breaking the jaw of one and snapping the arm of the other. The name of the crook taken to Murray North? William Bolton. Like I said before, quietness doesn't mean weakness. According to whispers, the pair of attackers had given an ultimatum to prove themselves. They needed to attack someone in order to prove their loyalty, giving the watchers a demonstration of their capability. Foolishly, the pair figured the quietest guy would be the perfect target. how wrong they were. While I don't consider William Bolton to be a monster to officers, I do think he became one to the two kids who tried to use him for their own twisted game. Perhaps they were the real monsters in this, the ones sent to hurt an innocent man, regardless of his own circumstances. When I do think of all the possible monsters who exist in this place, I shudder when I realize that I knew the worst of them all along. It took me years to understand the terrible truth, and when it finally dawned on me, it was enough to take me in a direction I never saw coming. So, who is the worst monster in this terrible place? Chapter 8. When I first tried to think about the absolute worst of them, one face repeatedly came to mind, and it is one I refuse to name. Not only will I never publish his name in any of my books, but I also refuse to give him a fake one, for he deserves absolutely no recognition for what he did. The man I write about murdered one of his children in a very public way, sending dozens of people straight to years of ongoing therapy. What they witnessed can only be described as absolute horror, with shocked onlookers unable to do a damn thing to help. On the day I first met him, he stepped off the bus with the weight of the world hanging over him. The very air around him felt toxic, almost to the point of being charged with an evil kind of electricity. The only thing anybody could think when they saw him was the child he had thrown to her doom. During my years inside, he was one of the few who physically affected me with just his presence. Whenever I saw him, either walking past or sitting in a room, the effect it had on me came with such intensity, the possibility of vomiting felt so real. He spoke to me a couple of times, and I can tell you that when I heard his voice and saw his eyes meet mine, the chills running down my spine felt like razor blades. He spooked me in a way nobody ever had before. But is he the worst? Do I consider him the worst monster of all? As I sit here writing this, thinking back to the time I spent inside and all the faces I met along the way, it is his face I expected to find at the top of the list when I speak the word monster. But what I find instead is something much more surprising in a way that hits even harder than him. I'm actually struggling right now as I try to write this next bit. The tears continue to build as I fight back the emotion to see each letter on the keyboard clearly. What I came to realize halfway through this book is that the real monsters, the ones who hurt us the most, aren't the prisoners sent to this place, but instead are the ones living in our own heads. Right now, I'm thinking back to friends I met along the way, as well as colleagues, while others who simply wore the same uniform I did. But together, we were a team, a part of something bigger, challenged with keeping real nightmares behind bars. Society needs us to keep them locked up, so they're unable to cause any more pain to the thousands whose lives have been forever altered by the crimes. And yet, while we watch the nightmares, who watches ours? There came a point in my career where I knew I had to get out. The demons inside my head began to grow in strength, refusing to subside when my shift ended. They followed me home, sitting in the middle of my mind wherever I went. I couldn't talk to anybody about it. What most of us believed was that if anybody found out we were struggling, it was a surefire way to get sacked. Our peers weren't any better, with most putting on a brave face each and every day. Some of them mocked weaker officers, pretending not to be affected by anything that happened on the job. And then there were those crazy enough for the place to leave no lasting effects on them, regardless of how bad things got. There must have been a half a dozen officers fall to mental health during my time, with more to disease. I say mental health because that's what officials choose to call it. I call it a distinct lack of support. A distinct lack of support is what eventually took them. That's how it should read. Want to know who the real monsters are? It's the voices we hear when we close our eyes after finishing a shift. It's the faces we see when we stare up at the ceiling when the lights go out. It's the horrific violence which continues to play out in our dreams, replays of the reality we face each and every day. The real monsters are the ones we cannot escape from, the ones who follow us home and invade the other side of our lives. The real monsters are the voices none of our loved ones can hear, the horrific memories nobody else can see, and the stresses we find unable to let go once our shift comes to an end. The sad reality I came to discover is that suicide isn't always the only ramification of this job. So is ill health, depression, disease, family breakdowns, loneliness, helplessness, and so much more. There are more divorced officers than married ones, and many of the married ones have previously been through a divorce in order to marry a fellow officer. People who date often hook up with another officer, and I really think it's because they believe those are the only ones who will truly understand. In other words, they get it. Wiping away the tears, I feel a little relieved that I got out virtually intact after my time inside. Yes, there were times where I didn't think I'd make it to the end of a shift. There were days where I felt completely incapable of going into work, instead using sick days to try and push the demons back into the shadows. Many didn't make it out unscathed, and for others, they lost their lives completely. There were some weeks after I left where it felt like I was receiving messages from colleagues almost daily about another one who had fallen, taken tragically way too soon, either through suicide, disease, a sudden heart attack, or stroke. It is not just for them I want to write these final words, but to them all across the world. Every correctional officer to ever put on a uniform to guard the monsters inside. Society may not know your face, but they know of your service. They may not have witnessed your battles, but they sleep a little easier knowing that at least some of the monsters remained locked behind bars. They may never know the courage you showed, but they do know the world is just a little bit safer. And while they may not know your name, I do want them to know of your sacrifice. Rest easy, friends. The final muster of the day has been called correct. Afterword. Wow, what a fitting line for me to end this book on. What a journey it's been. 4 years, almost to the day, 19 books, including the Inmates series, and such an emotional roller coaster along the way. I hope you've enjoyed this journey behind the walls and that I've managed to open your eyes to a world not many will ever see in their lifetime. I'm a little saddened to say that this really is the end for the Prison Days series. From here, if you haven't read them yet, there's the Inmates series. 5 short books giving you front row seats to specific prisoners I encountered throughout my journey. Believe me when I say I struggled with the final decision to end things here. I had always said I wanted to do a book about officers, and while the idea still hasn't been completely put to rest, at this point in time, I feel I need an extended break, one which I'm not sure the true crime author will return from. Perhaps I will leave the decision up to you, my most treasured memory of all, loyal reader. It is for you I began this journey in the first place, to try and give you a raw and unedited glimpse into a place described as one of the darkest on the planet. How did I do? Do you think I need to add to this series with an insight into some of the officers? Why not send me an email, prisondays@yahoo.com, and let me know your thoughts. If you haven't tried the Max series, it is one I do strongly recommend. In case you didn't know, Max stands for Maximum Security. That is a series I wrote to replicate some of the real horror I faced, meeting real challenges during my days. The series is often just as graphic as the real thing, and promises to rip your heart out along the way more than once. For now, I want to thank you for supporting me through this journey. Without you, this would never have been possible. And to you, I take off my hat. Reach out anytime. I love hearing from readers who had the courage to open one of my books. Until we meet again, please take care of yourself, stay safe, and I hope I never hear about your own trip behind the wire, unless you decided to see the madness for yourself. In gratitude, Simon King. This has been Prison Days, Meeting Monsters, a Twin Tales Publishing production. Written by Simon King. Narrated by Todd Waites. Copyright 2022 by Simon King. Production copyright 2023 by Simon King.